At 6:30 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Larner, later known as Ed Larner in some accounts, though his full name was Edward T. Larner, stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby, watching his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission that higher command had already called suicide. At 31 years old, with 72 combat missions, he had a frustrating record: 0 ships sunk. His target was a Japanese convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 elite soldiers from Rabaul to reinforce the bloody stalemate at Lae. Every transport that reached its destination meant another division the Allies would have to dig out of fortified jungle positions with unbearable casualties. The mathematics of high-altitude bombing were brutally clear. A bomb took 37 seconds to fall, time enough for a destroyer to steam over 3 football fields away. For 8 months, the 5th Air Force had tried, achieving a pitiful 3% hit rate. Bombs fell harmlessly into the ocean. Crews reported direct hits that were near misses, and the Japanese sailed on, their anti-aircraft fire methodically shooting down the vulnerable bombers. 4 of Larner's own aircraft had been lost in a month. The war in New Guinea was being lost not on the ground, but in the empty sea between the islands. Then General George Kenney, the maverick commander of the 5th Air Force, proposed an idea that sounded insane to every seasoned pilot: skip bombing. The concept was to fly in at a terrifying 50 feet above the waves, release a bomb with a delayed fuse just 300 yards from the target, and let it skip across the water like a stone, slamming into the ship's hull below the waterline. The theorists said it would work. The pilots knew it was a one-way ticket. Japanese destroyers were floating fortresses of 127mm guns and 25mm cannons, all perfectly capable of shredding a low-flying bomber. Command had banned the tactic twice, calling it a reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. But as Larner looked at the reconnaissance photos of the convoy steaming inexorably toward Lae, he faced an impossible choice: follow orders and watch the mission fail again, or embrace the insanity and risk everything. Unbeknownst to command, he had already made his decision. For weeks, in secret dawn raids, his men had been practicing against a wrecked ship on a remote reef. The official orders still forbade it, but Larner was about to lead his men on an unauthorized, desperate gamble that would either change the course of the Pacific War or be recorded as a catastrophic act of mutiny. Back in the operations tent, Larner spread the reconnaissance photos across a map table, the grainy images revealing the convoy's deadly formation. The plan he was about to brief was not just unauthorized, it was a direct violation of explicit orders. General Kenney's radical idea required a radical tool. The standard B-25 Mitchell, a medium-altitude level bomber, was utterly unsuited for this role. But 5th Air Force mechanics, working in sweltering hangars under Kenney's personal direction, had performed a brutal transformation. They ripped out the glass bombardier's nose and replaced it with a solid, menacing shell packed with 4 .50 caliber machine guns. 4 more were added in blister pods on the fuselage sides. This turned the bomber into a strafing beast, a commerce destroyer designed to hurl 200 rounds per second into a ship's decks. The theory was simple and brutal: silence the anti-aircraft guns by sheer volume of fire, forcing gunners to duck for cover during the bomber's final deadly approach. For Larner, watching his own plane being transformed was a mix of awe and dread. The modification added 1,200 pounds, altered the center of gravity, and created a new, untested aircraft type, something between a bomber and a giant, low-flying attack plane. It was an embodiment of desperation, a tangible bet that firepower could outweigh suicidal tactics. But a gun platform alone wasn't enough. The forbidden art of skip bombing had to be learned. In secret, Kenney had provided a practice target, The wreck of the SS Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Natiera Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. Its rusting, half-submerged hulk was perfect. At dawn and dusk, under poor light to avoid prying eyes, Larner's squadron practiced. They learned to skim wave tops at 270 miles per hour, a heart-stopping altitude where one gust could mean a watery grave. They learned the precise timing, the feel of the release, and they learned the cost of error. Lieutenant Jake Foss Fawcett learned it on February 16th. Coming in too high at 70 feet, his bomb skipped twice, cleanly over the Pruth, and detonated harmlessly beyond it. The next run, corrected to a lethal 45 feet, saw the bomb skip once and slam into the hull below the waterline, right where a ship's magazine would be. The wreck didn't shoot back, though. As Larner finalized the attack plan, assigning each pilot a specific transport, the unspoken truth hung in the humid air. Tomorrow, the target would be a convoy bristling with weapons, manned by crews who had survived previous attacks and were waiting for them. The rehearsals were over. The court-martial offense was committed. All that remained was to see if this forbidden gamble would yield victory or court-martial papers, if they survived at all. In the cramped briefing tent, the air thick with tension and cigarette smoke, Major Larner pointed to the grainy reconnaissance photos. The mathematics of the attack were as precise as they were terrifying. He outlined the plan they had rehearsed in secret, but were now ordered to execute for real. Approach altitude? 50 feet, so low that altimeters were unreliable, and pilots would have to judge by the spray off the wave tops. Speed? 270 miles per hour. Release point? A mere 300 yards from the target. A ship could cover in seconds. Bomb trajectory? A shallow 8-degree angle. A 5-second delayed fuse. Miss any one variable, and the bomb would skip over the ship, sink prematurely, or fail to detonate. Larner assigned each of his 9 B-25s a specific target, prioritizing the heavy transports. The strategy was one of overwhelming simultaneous shock. 1 bomber per ship, 1 pass, 1 bomb. No second chances. Above them, a diversionary force of B-17 flying fortresses would bomb from 10,000 feet, forcing the convoy to maneuver and break formation. At wave-top height, Australian bow fighters would make strafing runs to suppress anti-aircraft fire, while P-38 Lightnings prowled high above to engage any Japanese Zero fighters. The entire complex plan was a clockwork of violence, and Larner's low-level squadron was the final, decisive hammer blow. If any piece failed, if the fighters were late, if the weather closed in, if the Japanese escorts were more alert than expected, his men would fly straight into a concentrated wall of flak with no escape. At 0700 hours, the crews filed out to their waiting aircraft. The morning was humid, the sky a threatening gray. 54 men across 9 bombers performed their final checks in a silence broken only by the clang of tools and the whine of starter motors. There were no heroic speeches. Each man understood the grim statistics and had seen the cost of failure during the secret practice runs. Larner climbed into his cockpit, the familiar space now feeling like a trap. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, ran through the pre-flight checklist with methodical calm. In the modified nose, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, now acting as both bombardier and front gunner, checked the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. At 0745, Larner released the brakes and began his takeoff roll down the coral runway, his twin R-2600 Cyclone engines roaring as they devoured fuel and distance. One by one, the other B-25s followed into the murky sky. They formed up not for a climb, but for a descent, dropping to an altitude so low that Japanese coastal radar could not distinguish them from the sea's surface. As they headed out over the Solomon Sea, navigation became a gut-wrenching challenge of dead reckoning against a featureless expanse of water.
A few degrees off course, and they would miss the convoy entirely, wasting the mission and leaving the troops at lay to their fate. The plan was set. The dice were thrown. By 9:30, they would know if their forbidden tactic was genius or folly.
At 8:52 a.m., a smudge of black smoke appeared on the horizon, the telltale sign of the Japanese convoy. Larner clicked his throat microphone once, the signal to spread the formation. The plan snapped into motion. First, the Australian bowfighters screamed in from the northeast, their 20mm cannons raking the destroyer's decks, forcing anti-aircraft gunners to duck and swivel their weapons away. Moments later, the high-altitude B-17s unloaded their bombs from 10,000 feet. Though they scored no direct hits, their purpose was achieved. The convoy erupted into evasive chaos, ships turning hard to port and starboard, their neat columns scattering. This was the moment. Larner pushed the throttles forward and descended to the final, gut-wrenching altitude of 40 feet. The ocean swell seemed to reach up for his wings. At 2,000 yards from his target, a 700-foot transport, he squeezed the trigger. All 8 .50 caliber machine guns in his nose and fuselage blazed, walking a trail of fire and shattered steel across the ship's superstructure, suppressing the gun crews. The closing speed was dizzying. At 300 yards, he felt the aircraft lurch upward as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. It hit the water, skipped once like a flat stone, and vanished. For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing. Then a colossal eruption of flame and water at the transport's waterline. The ship shuddered, its back broken. To his left and right, his wingmen achieved identical, devastating results. In under 90 seconds, skip bombing had transformed from a forbidden theory into a horrifyingly effective reality. But the Japanese response was swift and brutal. A destroyer on the flank, its gunners now tracking the low-flying threat, found its mark. Shells walked through the formation, and one connected with Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The aircraft, its own bombs still attached, vaporized in a fireball. No parachutes. 5 men gone in an instant. The battle descended into a maelstrom of smoke, tracers, and thunderous explosions. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett, applying the harsh lessons from the Pruth, put his bomb squarely amidships on a second transport. Captain Bill Hayes sank a destroyer with a hit to its stern. Yet the sky became deadly. Japanese Zero fighters, having evaded the high cover, dove into the fray. A Zero latched on to the damaged B-25 of Lieutenant Paul Warren, whose plane was already streaming fuel. A final, accurate burst sent Warren into the sea. Amid the carnage, the tactical victory was undeniable. 7 of the 8 fat transports were burning or sinking. The sea was littered with debris, oil, and struggling soldiers. Larner, his own port engine damaged and oil pressure dropping, gave the order to break off. They had proven the tactic, but at a searing cost. As he turned for home, the vision of Mitchell's disintegrating bomber seared into his mind, a stark reminder that their revolutionary success was written in the currency of their own blood. Larner's damaged B-25, trailing a thin wisp of smoke and oil, clawed its way back toward the New Guinea coast. In the cockpit, the roar of the single straining engine was deafening, a stark contrast to the grim silence of the crew. The port engine, hit by shrapnel, threatened to seize at any moment. Larner ordered everything non-essential jettisoned, ammunition, tools, even weapons, to lighten the crippled bomber. Below them, the Bismarck Sea was a fading scar of smoke and destruction. Ahead, salvation was a razor-thin margin. With the feathered propeller of the dead engine creating drag, the aircraft barely maintained altitude, the altimeter hovering just above the waves. When the coastline finally emerged from the haze, it was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. Larner nursed the plane onto the Port Moresby runway at 11:17 hours, the landing gear groaning under the uneven weight. As he cut the engines, an overwhelming silence engulfed them, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. They had been in the air for 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Climbing out, they were met not by cheers, but by the anxious faces of ground crews and intelligence officers. Word of the convoy's devastation was already crackling over radios, but the cost was still unknown. The debriefing was a clinical, exhausting dissection of violence. Larner reported the hits, the explosions, the sinking ships. Then came the ledger of loss. Mitchell and his crew, vaporized. Jensen shot down on his second run. Warren lost to the Zeros. 4 bombers, 20 men. By evening, the full, horrifying scale of the victory became clear. Reconnaissance photos showed 7 transports and 2 destroyers sunk, the 8th transport beached and burning. General George Kenney arrived, examined the evidence, and issued a terse final order: finish it. That evening, a second strike obliterated the remnants. The strategic impact was immediate and total. Of the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who sailed, only about 1,200 ragged survivors eventually reached Leh, combat ineffective. The Japanese Navy would never again risk a major convoy within range of Allied land-based air power in the region. However, the personal cost for Larner and his men was just beginning to calcify. In the days that followed, disturbing reports filtered back from PT boats and pilots on follow-up raids, the systematic strafing of lifeboats and survivors in the water. The battle had started as a tactical engagement, but had degenerated into a grim harvest, a cycle of vengeance for downed airmen shot in their parachutes. This unspoken, brutal aftermath was omitted from official reports, but lived in the minds of the men. The U.S. Army Air Forces now had a war-winning tactic, but its creator, Ed Larner, carried a different kind of weight. He had proven that courage and innovation could shatter a convoy, but he had also learned that success in total war extracts a price that isn't measured in tonnage sunk or medals awarded, but in a permanent alteration of the soul. The operations tent at Port Moresby hummed with a tense, exhausted energy. For 2 hours, Major Larner and his surviving pilots sat under the harsh light, reliving the battle for stone-faced intelligence officers. The questions were precise, cyclical. How many ships hit? At what angle? How many seconds between release and explosion? The process was a mechanical reconstruction of chaos, an attempt to quantify the unquantifiable fury they had just unleashed and endured. Outside, ground crews swarmed over the returning B-25s, patching bullet holes, assessing damaged engines, and counting empty ammunition chutes. The human cost was being tallied separately. 4 bombers lost, 20 men missing or confirmed dead. The victory felt abstract, distant, buried under the immediate weight of fatigue and the hollow faces of the crews who made it back. This grim accounting was interrupted at 1300 hours by the arrival of the first concrete evidence of their success. An Australian reconnaissance Beaufort had overflown the battle area, and its photos were rushed to the tent. As the grainy images were laid out, a silent, profound shift occurred. There, in stark black and white, was the proof. 7 of the 8 transports were either submerged or burning wrecks, listing heavily in the oil-slicked water. The 8th was beached on the New Britain coast, a column of dark smoke rising from its superstructure. The theory was no longer theory, it was a fact etched in sunken steel. This evidence set the stage for the next act. At 1600 hours, the man who had staked his reputation on the forbidden tactic arrived.
General George Kenny entered the tent without ceremony, his eyes immediately locking onto the reconnaissance photos spread across the table. He moved from one image to the next, a commander studying the results of his most dangerous gamble. There were no handshakes, no congratulations for the exhausted men present. The battle, for Kenny, was not over. His finger came down decisively on the photograph of the beached transport, still smoking but potentially salvageable, its cargo and troops perhaps recoverable. His order was as cold and clear as the tactical problem it addressed. Finish it. The surviving Japanese soldiers and crew from the sunken ships were struggling toward shore, and the beached vessel represented a last chance for the enemy to salvage something from the disaster. Kenny's command meant total annihilation. There would be no respite, no opportunity for the enemy to regroup. As dusk approached, a fresh wave of bombers was readied. Larner, his own plane crippled and his spirit burdened with the day's losses, stood on the rain-slicked runway and watched a new squadron of B-25s take off into the blood-red sunset. Their mission was one of grim finality, underscoring a brutal truth of the Pacific War. A tactical victory was only as complete as the thoroughness of the destruction that followed. The battle had been won that morning, but the killing was mandated to continue until nightfall.
The aftermath of the Bismarck Sea was not just a victory. It was a seismic shift in naval warfare. Overnight, skip bombing evolved from a court-martial offense to official Fifth Air Force doctrine. The Japanese Imperial Navy, reeling from the catastrophic loss, was forced into an impossible dilemma. To move troops and supplies, they needed convoys, but convoys within range of Allied air power were now deemed suicidal. The supply line to their critical forward garrisons in New Guinea was effectively severed, dooming thousands of soldiers to isolation and defeat. However, the enemy was quick to adapt. Within months, new convoys sailed under the cover of darkness with drastically increased anti-aircraft armament, specifically more 25mm cannons positioned to counter low-level attacks, and with larger dedicated fighter escorts. When American B-25s attacked a similarly reinforced convoy in June 1943, they paid a steeper price, losing 3 aircraft for diminished results. The free pass was over. The battle had proven the tactic's lethality, but it also ignited a relentless cycle of innovation and countermeasure that would define the air war over the Pacific. This cycle spurred a technological arms race. American engineers, working with combat reports, responded by transforming the B-25 into an even more formidable gun platform. They added armor around cockpits and engines, and, most strikingly, increased the forward firing battery to 12 and, in some cases, 14 50-caliber machine guns. The modified aircraft, dubbed strafer models, could deliver a near-solid wall of lead to suppress shipboard defenses. The tactics, too, grew more sophisticated. Coordinated, multi-layered assaults became standard. High-altitude B-17s or B-24s would force ships to maneuver. Fighters would engage enemy air cover and strafe decks, and only then would the skip-bombing B-25s make their final, decisive run. This refined approach restored the Allies' devastating edge, culminating in raids like the November 1943 massacre of Japanese shipping in Rabaul Harbor. The doctrine spread globally. The British RAF adopted it with Beaufighters and Mosquitoes against German coastal traffic, while the Soviet Air Force attempted it, albeit with less success and higher losses. The statistics were undeniable. Skip bombing was over 15 times more effective than high-altitude attacks. Yet this revolution carried a profound human cost. The psychological toll on crews flying these terrifying, unwavering approaches into concentrated flak was immense, leading to unprecedented rates of combat fatigue. The tactic won battles, but it also broke men, creating a new kind of veteran who had stared directly into the maw of naval anti-aircraft fire and whose hands would forever remember the vibration of 8 machine guns firing at once. Major Ed Larner returned to the United States in mid-1943, a veteran of 88 combat missions. He was decorated, promoted, and hailed as a hero within the Air Force for proving a decisive tactic. Yet the man who walked away was profoundly different from the one who had led the desperate charge. The Army wanted him to train a new generation of skip bombers, to institutionalize the hard-won knowledge. Larner refused. Instead, he requested a transfer to Transport Command, spending the remainder of the war flying unarmed C-47s across the vast Pacific. It was a silent but eloquent statement. He had given enough. He mustered out in 1945 with a Distinguished Flying Cross and other honors, but he returned to a quiet civilian life in California, his obituary decades later containing only a single vague line about his military service. He had asked his family not to discuss the details, a wish they respected. In the official histories and the public memory, the flamboyant General George Kenney received the lion's share of credit for conceiving skip bombing doctrine. This was a narrative Larner never contested. For him, the true legacy was not in the credit, but in the lives of the pilots he trained and the grim knowledge that his gamble had worked, a knowledge forever tempered by the memory of the crews who did not return. The tangible relics of that pivotal battle are scarce. The specific B-25s that flew on March 2, 1943, were worn out and scrapped. Today, restored Mitchells in museums like the Smithsonian or the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force stand as symbolic tributes to all squadrons, not as artifacts from the Bismarck Sea. The battle itself remains overshadowed in popular memory by Midway or Guadalcanal, a decisive yet forgotten turning point. Its true monument is not in metal or stone, but in the fundamental shift it forced in global naval strategy. Larner and his men proved that the calculus of naval power had changed irrevocably. Henceforth, control of the sea required control of the air down to the very wavetops. The tactic they pioneered was refined, copied, and became a cornerstone of anti-shipping warfare, contributing directly to the strangulation of Japan. The story endures, not as a simple tale of heroism, but as a complex lesson in desperate innovation, the brutal efficiency of new tactics, and the silent, personal cost carried by those who turn the tide of history. It is a memory kept alive not by grand monuments, but by the relentless curiosity of history itself, ensuring that the courage and sacrifice of those 9 crews over a tumultuous sea continues to resonate across the decades.